There are several clubs in the Premier League who've been very successful in recruiting and scouting players using data. One of them is Brighton, another is Brentford, and another of them is Liverpool. Now, Liverpool's head of data insights, Ian Graham, he stresses that if you're going to work as a data scientist, it's recruitment that you should focus on. It's here that you can actually save the club a lot of money. And this is because player salaries are extremely large and they're a massive part of the club's budget. If you can find that hidden gem, somebody who might be a few bit cheaper for the first few years, after a bit they're going to actually want to increase their salary, but if you can find that hidden gem, then you can save a lot of money and that can lead to sporting success. And that's exactly how Liverpool have worked over the last 5, 6, 7 years. Some of it is based on data, some of it is based on sensible financials, which I suppose is also related to data, and some of it is just based on very good ability to spot good players. Now, Liverpool, of course, they've always been one of the top 6 clubs, so they've always had a reasonably big budget, and it probably goes up and down for these different clubs, how successful they are with these types of things. But 2 more striking examples are Brighton and Brentford. And they're both striking because they're both run by former gamblers who've bought their club, their childhood club that they supported. They've bought the club and then they've brought in data practices. They've brought in practices based on gambling, how you deal with randomness and so on, in order to structure up the club in a much more rigorous way, you would say. And part of that is using data. We'll come back a little bit to those clubs later. But what I'm going to do today is teach you some of the basics of scouting. How can we use data to assess scouting? Now, this is going to stretch over 2 lessons. Lesson 3 today is statistical scouting. We're going to look at some of the basic numbers that you can use to scout players. Then in lesson 4, we're going to move over to more advanced machine learning techniques for evaluating players. One thing I'll come back to and emphasize time and time again is there is no single number for scouting football players. Sometimes if we think about Moneyball and baseball, then, well, there's no single number there either, but there are a small number of numbers to do with the success rates of the batsman, the success rates of the bowlers, sorry, I'm not very good at baseball, but the throwers. Those numbers, because you have lots of one-on-one situations, those numbers can be very successfully used in order to recruit players. The same isn't true in football because it's a more complex sport. There's more dynamics going on. There's less that we can assess with simple numbers. And so what we're going to learn today is that, well, there is no single number. We need to learn how to treat and use a variety of numbers when we're scouting players. We already started in lesson 1 looking at actions on the pitch. And the simplest, most straightforward way in order to evaluate players is just to see how many of those actions they do per 90 minutes, per minute played. Now, if you look on the Premier League webpage or you look on the stats that you're presented with on television, you'll see these types of numbers. This is a ranking from 2 seasons ago. And what you can find here is you can find lists of assists, clean sheets, appearances, minutes played, number of passes made, number of touches made, shots, and so on. And then these particular statistics can be ranked for different players. I think that this is passes. Now, there is some value to these types of numbers, but what we're going to find out is that there's very little we can learn about the football players just simply by the number of passes they make or the number of shots they make. Of course, for strikers, the number of goals they score is definitely important, but almost everything else is not going to be enough for us to be able to scout football players. The next stage on from this, and these are the statistics used often by professional scouts. So scouts will go off and they'll watch particular players play, and they'll give them when scouts, and this is something we're not going to go so much into today, when a professional scout works, what he or she will do is that they'll have a piece of paper where they note down key attributes of that player. And sometimes they'll also note down the number of a particular type of run they make that the team might be interested in, and they collect up those types of statistics. But the main thing they're doing there is evaluating the qualitative aspects of the player. They're also looking a little bit about how he or she behaves off the ball. When they're kind of, when there's one thing when the TV camera's on you and you're playing your best, but then there's another aspect of how you always take those runs and so on. So a professional scout will look at a lot of things to do with the player's attitude, to do with the player's qualities, what type of actions that they perform over and over again, and then note down a qualitative or a semi-qualitative report on that player. But in addition to that, most professional scouts these days will look at these types of numbers. These are from the Y-Scout platform, where scouts can actually watch video footage of the different players, and at the same time they'll be presented with a variety of these types of statistics. Now, this is a position of a centre-back, so you can see there's a little heat map there. There's goals, which is low in this case. There's shots, and then there's percentages associated with these things. So this is shots on target, so percentage of the shots made that are on target. This number, 0.43, this is per 90 minutes, so 0.43 shots per 90 minutes. Passes per 90 minutes, 46, with an accuracy of 80%. We have a little bit more detail here: long passes, crosses, dribbles, duels, and so on. And these are starting to build up some kind of idea about what this player is, how successful he is with making particular passes and so on. But they're still not going to be enough. And one of the reasons is we have no context for them at all. So pass accuracy, 80%, I don't really know how the accuracy of a typical centre-back from this statistic. Maybe I get some experience and I can get some idea about that, but I have no way of really comparing that player to the rest of the league. And also, I don't know if these things really correlate with successful play. We've already looked at some models where we try to say, well, doing this action leads to more success in football, but do we really know that accurate passes lead to more success in football? And that leads us to the following thing. We need to think carefully about what we measure. And this is where I make the argument, maybe sound a bit negative about baseball earlier, but this is where I make the argument that statistics is going to be more difficult in football than it is in sports like baseball, because we need to think carefully about what is a successful action. Now, the classic quote to use to illustrate this is by Paolo Maldini. And he said the following: he said that if I have to make a tackle, then I've already made a mistake, okay? And this isn't quite true. You can actually look on YouTube and there's some pretty spectacular tackles made by Paolo Maldini. But the point that he's making here is that tackles are a last resort. If you're well positioned, that you can make an interception, that you can prevent the pass being made at all, then you're doing your job as a defender. The tackle is something you do when everything has gone wrong. So if we measure the number of tackles made by a player, then what we're measuring is how many times they've actually made a mistake, which is not what we want to measure at all. So just purely tackle statistics are not going to tell us whether a player is good or not. Or they might in some contexts, but they won't in all contexts. And that's really that's the difficulty with these types of things. But tackles per se is not going to tell us how good a player is. And here's another one. This is an example I took from Transfermarkt. What they had done is they made a list of the players with the highest completion rate of passes in the big 5 leagues. So they took the Premier League, La Liga, Serie A, the French League, Ligue 1, and the Bundesliga. And they looked to see which players were most successful in completing a pass. And so a completed pass is a pass that goes from the passer to the receiver and is successfully received without any type of interception. And they found the following. They found that Kimpembe has a pass success rate of 95%. And Thiago Silva, this is a few seasons ago, he had a pass completion rate of 95.5%. And they were the top pass completion rate players in the league. Now, there's several things that should make you suspicious about this particular statistic. Well, there's one thing in particular. They play in the same team together, so they might now and again pass each other. And also, they play as centre-backs. So what this pass completion is to do with is Paris Saint-Germain are the strongest team in the league. They dominate the play and they hold possession until they feel that they have a good chance to break through a defence. And while they're holding possession, these two are passing the ball backwards and forwards between each other and they never lose it. But that doesn't necessarily mean that they're great passers of the ball. It's not that difficult to roll the ball backwards and forwards between the backs. So pass completion rate, in this sense, really doesn't tell us about who the best passers of the ball are. Now, I said a couple of things. So first of all, we looked at these statistics and I said, yeah, they're not precisely, they're not going to measure the things that we'd like them to measure. But also I said another problem with these is that they're not ranked relative to anything. So we don't really know, even if these were good numbers, dribbles, for example, might be quite a good number to have. We don't know how many dribbles a centre-back does and how successful they are. So how can we compare them to other players in the league? That brings us to our next point. We should use percentile rankings. So whenever we rank a player, we should rank them relative to the league. There's going to come up a problem later where we have to actually rank the different leagues against each other, but we'll avoid that for just now. We'll say that what we're going to do is we're going to rank a player relative to all the other players in the league, because that will give us a feeling for how good that player is. And how do we do this? Well, imagine, and this is a little bit of a fake example here, we've got a list of people with very English names, and they have a particular score. This might be number of passes that they've completed in a per 90. And David's made 31 passes, Andrew's made 44, George has made 38. You get the idea. And what we want to do is we want to rank them in percentiles. So the following ranking is what we make. Okay, so that really all we do is we sort them. And so if you're writing this as a code, you just need to sort them based on their rank. So Andrew made 45 passes, and that's the highest number. So he is ranked 1. We'll put him at percentile 100. William made 43. That's the second highest. We put him rank 2, 87.5, and so on. Down to here we have John and George. They had the same number of passes. They were on 38. So we give them both rank 5.5, and then we give them percentile 43.7. The way we change these ranks then into percentile is we say, well, there's 8 players, so we're going to give them each 1/8. So the bottom player, David, he only made 31 passes. Sorry, David, not so good. He's got 12.5, which is 1/8. Jack is at 2/8, 25%. And then when we have a tie, we have John and George, they're on 5.5 each. We go halfway between 3/8 and 4/8 to give our percentile ranking. And then top, of course, we have the 100th percentile. There's slightly different ways of doing this transfer to percentiles, but we always want to be ranking between 0 and 100 for the player. And then we can actually say that Andrew is the 100th percentile best player in the league. David, well, he's bottom of the league. He's in the bottom 12.5 percentile in this case. The next thing we need to think about is we want to adjust for the team that the player plays with as much as possible. We also want to think about the league too. I've mentioned that a few times, but let's start by adjusting for the team. Now, in the exercise or in the Python notebook, which you can work with after this, we show how to make a player radar for a striker. And we make a player radar for Mohamed Salah. And I'm going to go through the details in a little bit about how we make the player radar, but what we see here is that on the left, we have Mohamed Salah in terms of the statistics that he has during the season. So there's different things like key passes, smart passes, expected goals is up there, goals, non-penalty goals are up there, assists. So these are all actions per 90. Now, percentile rankings, we say that when he's near to the middle here, so these are actually the percentile. This is the 20%, 40%, 60%, 80%, 100%. So if he's all the way out here, as he is with non-penalty goals, he's top in the league at scoring goals. And here he's on around the 90 percentile. If we take something here like aerial duels one, he's actually in the bottom 10, 20 percentile. And these radars give then a ranking. And the point I want to make here is that these change slightly if we adjust for possession. So Liverpool have more possession typically than their opponents. I think this would be even more extreme if we took a player from Manchester City, but Liverpool have more possession. So what we do here is we divide through by the possession he has. And if you look carefully at key passes, for example, he was just up here in this is 80, just over 60 percentile. And then when we take into account, adjust for possession, he goes under the 60 percentile. This is because we correct by dividing the number of key passes he's made by the proportion of time that Liverpool have possession of the ball during their matches. And that gives this corrected radar. Okay, so I've presented the radar up front here. The next thing we need to do is learn a little bit how we build this radar. And the main way you're going to learn how to build it is by going into the next page and going through the steps yourself in Python. But let me just say a few words about the things that we've chosen to put into the radar. We're going to build a radar which just measures strikers and wingers. And one thing I haven't mentioned about the percentiles is that whenever you build a radar of a particular position, you compare to other players of that position. So we're going to take all the strikers and wingers in the Premier League season, 17-18, which this data was collected for, and we're going to compare the percentile rankings of each other in the form of this player radar. Okay, so what metrics are we going to use? Well, this is definitely more of an art than a science. Again, going back to this baseball, maybe the statistics there are relatively straightforward, the types of things you want to get. In football, it's going to depend on the position played to a very big degree. And it's also going to depend, even within the position, it's going to depend on the type of the player that you want to have. Now, and as I said, we're going to spend a few lessons on this scouting thing. So this is really just a start, but it's quite a nice start, what things that we can measure. Well, let's start with the standard metrics. So I said even on the Premier League web pages, you see a couple of useful metrics, and those are assists and goals. If you're going to be a striker, you've got to score goals. If you're not scoring goals, you've got to be providing assists to your teammates, so passes before the goal. And so we have them up here, assists and non-penalty goals. Salah, even accounting for the fact that he was penalty taker, he scored the most non-penalty goals in this particular season. He also was up there on the 80 percentile of assists. These are the corrected ones for per minute played. Then there's a bunch of scouting metrics: smart passes, key passes, ground and aerial duels. These are all statistics that come from the Y-Scout dataset, and you can read on the Y-Scout pages how they define these. But these are the sorts of statistics that scouts will typically be talking about: how many key passes they've made, how successful they are in ground duels, beating players on the ground, and how successful they are in aerial duels, beating players in the air. And you can see that Salah in this season was not particularly successful in aerial duels. These all come directly from qualifiers in the Y-Scout data. What we do when we build our radar here is we actually wanted to add some context to some of these metrics. As I've said, pass percentage completion is not necessarily a good measure of success, but passing in the final third is, because it's much more difficult to do a pass in the final third. So we constructed a metric here where we look to see balls that were received or were made and then ended in the final third by the players. And you can see that Salah is very successful on both of these metrics. He's able to pass the ball in the final third and he's able to receive the ball in the final third. So just by adding that context of we're in the final third, we can be more successful, we can make a better metric for the players. And finally, we have expected goals. So we looked at that last time in our when we started looking at statistical measures. What are the quality of the chances produced? And Salah is highly ranked in expected goals as he is in real goals. So he gets into good shooting positions and he converts those shooting positions. He's very good at that particular skill. Now, this is probably the hardest part, and it's also the hardest part to say something sensible about, is that you really have to know the limitations. You really have to sort of get into this, right? So when we've constructed a particular radar for a player, it's not just enough to say, well, this is the number, we think that this number is going to describe your dream player. You have to know the limitations of what you've done. And those limitations include things, as I've mentioned a few times, is that these players, you might have 5 or 6 players playing in different leagues around the world. You have to be able to assess the strength of those leagues. You have to be able to think about the role that that player has in the club. So even if we've done this possession adjustment, some players will have a more ball-playing role, some will have a more defensive role, and that doesn't mean they can't do the other things. It just means that that's their particular task. So all these details about the player have to be in your head at the same time as the picture. And this is particularly important when you'll have more of a traditional scout who's actually been watching the players, and you have a scout who, and you have yourself who's done the numbers, and you somehow want to combine the knowledge that you've got from these two sources, the traditional source and that source. And you need to listen to the scout, listen and find out what are the important qualities that that player had when in this qualitative assessment, and combine that with the numerical measures that you've created and come to a final understanding. I can't emphasize this enough, that it is never enough just to make an impressive radar and say we need to sign this particular player. It's always this backwards and forwards between a qualitative analysis and the quantitative analysis that you've done. There simply is no single number for scouting players. There's a few clever things you can do, and this is a tip that I learnt from Luke Bourne. I just remembered this just now, but Luke said to me that he's worked for Roma, and he's worked for analytics in basketball as well, where some of the challenges are very similar. And one thing that Luke does is that he will take statistics for particular matches that a player, this time he was talking about basketball, but maybe a scout has seen a match, or he's seen 2 or 3 matches of a player, and says that this player, they always say they're a baller. So a baller is a very good player. He's very sure that this player is extremely good. But what Luke does then is he says, well, what were the statistics for the particular match that the scout saw where he had this baller quality? And what are his general statistics for over a range of matches? And sometimes there's a discrepancy. You can either find out that the scout witnessed the match where this player was at their absolute best, or you can find that they witnessed a match where they weren't particularly good. And then that adds context. So that's a very simple example of just a small adjustment of introducing numbers and saying, was the match the scout saw the best match the player had ever played, or was it the worst match that the player had ever played? And then that helps add context to the scouting's qualitative report. It's maybe not the grandest use of numbers, but it's a very simple and effective use of numbers. Okay, let's look at a few case studies where we use these types of percentile rankings. In this example by Ran Srinivas and Matt Lawrence, what they've done is they've looked for ball-playing centre-backs in the Championship. And this is often where scouting can be at its most use. It's one thing, in the next example, we're going to look at player radars for the Premier League. It's one thing to make player radars for Premier League players who are already very successful. But when you're doing scouting, of course, you're looking for players to maybe lift up from the Championship to the Premier League, or you're looking for League One and League Two players to lift up to the Championship, or you're looking for players in Cyprus, Albania, or all across the world who might fit the profile of the club that you're scouting for. So that's really the kind of goldmine effect. That's where, as I said in the beginning, that Ian Graham says you can make the really big discoveries. Because it's in these leagues where you can make the big discoveries or the money-saving discoveries for your club. So Championship, they've taken a number of statistics, and as I said, they're looking for a ball-playing centre-back, and so they've just taken 3 statistics here at the top, which are to do with defensive actions, and they've summed up tackles, interceptions, and blocks into one, and the P adjusted means that they've done possession adjusted. Then, actually, no, sorry, they've only done 2 defensive things. They've done aerial defense and they've done the sum of these tackles, interceptions, and blocks. Then they focused on the ability of the player to pass the ball forward. And so through balls per 90, you can see here is the percentile ranking. So this is rather than having this on a radar, as we've seen previously, we basically have a percentile ranking 0 up to 100. And this particular player, Adam Webster, he is top in terms of final third passes per 90. He's also very high, 88th percentile in terms of through balls. But one thing to notice here is that his forward pass accuracy is not particularly high compared to other things. So it's at the 50%. So he is very successful in making final third passes, but he needs quite a lot of tries in order to make those final third passes. So this gives us a sort of feeling, and we can compare this to different players, and that's exactly what they do in the blog. You can get a feeling for the style of that player. This player definitely progresses the ball, then makes a reasonable number of mistakes doing so. That might be a good thing or it might be a bad thing. Again, it depends what type of player that you're looking for. So a company who've really specialized in creating player radars for specific positions, which can kind of show the difference between the style of play of players playing in those positions, are StatsBomb. This is a very nice example of this. This is their template for strikers. And we have Aubameyang here, Aguero and Lacazette. And these radars are very different shapes. Now, I'm not going to go into every one of these measurements. I think you should go through them yourself and have a look afterwards. But I'm going to bring your attention to a few of them. So I quite like this one with Aubameyang. He has expected goals per shot. Sorry about my presentation. Sorry about my pronunciation. His expected goals per shot is one of the highest in the league. And this means that he gets into very good shooting positions before he shoots. This isn't this isn't true to the same degree for Aguero, for example, or for Lacazette. And so you can see this is what those players are specifically good at. And getting into the details of a few others of these, I like this one, pressure regains. Times a player's team won the ball back within 5 seconds of the player pressurizing an opponent per 90 minutes. Okay, so now we can really talk about context. The idea here is that this is the 5-second rule, Pep Guardiola's 5-second rule of winning the ball back. How good are the team at winning the ball back if this player has gone into press, right? And so now we can see some differences between the players. Lacazette is particularly good at this. His pressure regains are amongst the highest in the league. Aguero's maybe there at sort of 80 percentile. Aubameyang is not the strongest at this particular. That's not his speciality. Another one here, you can again have a look at these later, but another one here, turnovers. How often a player loses the ball via a miscontrol or a failed dribble. So does the player lose the ball in various situations? And those turnovers are here, and you always put good things out at the edges here. So again, Aubameyang is good at turnovers. He doesn't have many turnovers against him. The other two are middle ranking in this particular statistic. Have a look at a few of these different ones and get a feeling for them. But these really pin down this idea of context, that it's not enough just to count up actions. You've got to give some kind of context to what you're looking for. This is another example comparing Kanté and De Bruyne. And you really see that, well, should come as no surprise. Kanté is very high up there on the adjusted tackle, interception metrics. And this probably says a little bit more subtle thing about the tackles than the Paolo Maldini quote said at the start, because Kanté does do tackles, he does do successful tackles and get the ball back, and then he is quite highly ranked on these things. But you can really see him coming up there on the defensive metrics. And Kevin De Bruyne, he's just the champion of assisting expected goals. So this is the pass which leads to expected goals. This is expected goal build-up. We're going to come to that later. That's, are you involved in a pass that leads to a high expected goal chance? And deep progressions are, well, getting the ball into the final third and so on. Then defenders, this is quite relevant to you because the exercise that we're going to look, the assignment number 2 is going to be looking at defensive actions. I thought that this one is quite interesting actually, given our position now. So this is Virgil van Dijk, the season that he signed for Liverpool. And this is Harry Maguire in his last season for Leicester before he signed for Manchester United. And I think there's a few question marks really that come up about Harry Maguire. Not a high number of pressures, passing success isn't particularly large, expected goal build-up. None of these statistics really stand out for him. And so it's very easy to talk about these things in hindsight, but maybe if you were looking at this in 2017, 2018, you might not think that it was worth paying so much money for Harry Maguire at that stage. I'm not sure. Well, Virgil van Dijk, of course, now he's moved to Liverpool. He came from Southampton. He has these statistics that you're looking for high in every area. Now that said, and they emphasize this, Ted Knudsen, who did this analysis, he emphasizes this in the article, we have to be very careful how we use defensive metrics because of these problems to do with not measuring what happens off the ball. It's far too easy to start staring at clearances and so on and think that we know the player on the basis of that. So we do have to be particularly careful when we're looking at defensive metrics. But the challenge for you is to try and come up with as best defensive metrics as you can in assignment 2. Last thing, I've said this a few times. I don't want to give the impression that there is no use in doing these scouting exercises. There's a lot of use in it, but it is more of an art than a science. There just isn't this single correct answer, this number which tells you whether you should sign a player or not. There's a process where you and the domain expert, as we might call them, in this case the scout, the domain expert and you agree together what is a good signing. You definitely have to use your insight into watching that player together with the numbers in order to make informed decisions. Now, we've touched on relatively basic statistics, counts of actions. We've put context in various ways, but we haven't up to now used any types of machine learning or statistical methods to really evaluate the players. And that is what we're going to look at next time. We're going to take the next step and we're going to say, can we use a machine or use a machine learning method in order to evaluate what's a good action and what's a less good action? And I'm not going to say so much more about that now. We'll come back to that. That's going to be lesson 4. See you next time. Bye.